Welcome to Stingtaz Podcast. Today we're jumping straight into something big, a multi-billion-dollar battleground, the software war that's really heating up in the automotive
It's
industry.
huge, yeah.
We've got this really insightful article from Inside EVs. The title says it all. Car companies are in a billion-dollar software war, and everyone's losing.
Oof, yes.
And it definitely stirred things up over on Hacker News, generated a lot of intense discussion.
Mhm.
So our plan today is to, really unpack this whole conflict. We want to dig into the core challenges facing the, let's call them traditional car
It's
manufacturers.
legacy players, right?
Exactly, and try to understand the different viewpoints, people working in the field, observers, basically what came out in that Hacker News thread.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah, and jumping right into that hack and news discussion, something really stood out from a user, Actronon93.
Okay,
Their point was, look, the main struggle for these traditional car companies, it's maybe not primarily a lack of software talent, like you might think.
interesting. So what is it then?
It's something more fundamental, their difficulty or maybe inability to build the actual electronics alongside the software, the hardware piece.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Atron 93 basically paints this picture where, you have great software ideas, but they're just suffocated by old or inadequate hardware.
Exactly. You can hire the best coders, design amazing features, but if the car's underlying systems, the ECUs, the communication pathways, the APIs, if they aren't there or they're just too slow,
Then the features just don't work properly, or they're laggy, clunky.
precisely, we're talking about delays that, in a car, that's not just frustrating, it could even be unsafe in some contexts.
Hmm.
And it definitely leads to those sluggish, poorly designed infotainment systems a lot of us have probably experienced.
So connecting that dot then, this points to a major strategic difference, doesn't it?
It really does. Like Etron 93 mentioned, you look at companies like Tesla, Rivian, a lot of the newer Chinese EV makers,
Hmm.
they have this big advantage because they tend to do it all in-house.
They control the whole stack, hardware and software.
Right. Designing the electronics, manufacturing them, writing the software.
Yeah.
That tight integration, it allows for, well, a much smoother, more optimized product.
But it's not a quick fix for the legacy guys, is it?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
His comment also notes, shifting to building your own electronics, that's a massive undertaking. It takes huge investment, a lot of time, years probably.
And this hardware limitation, it causes other problems too, right? Like communication issues within the car itself. I saw another user, Daniel HB, talking about that.
Oh yeah, Daniel HB's experience was really telling. They said they spent something like upwards of 80% of their time just trying to wrestle with the complexity of how all the different electronic bits and pieces in the car talk to each other.
80%, that's huge.
It is. And the analogy they used was pretty vivid. Imagine every single connection between the car's little computers, the microcontrollers.
Yeah.
Imagine each one speaking its own custom, binary, incompatible digital language
Wow.
and running on different, maybe outdated versions of internet protocols. It's like trying to get dozens of devices to work together when they all speak different obscure dialects. That's the kind of chaos they were managing.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare. Daniel HB even said their team had to basically invent their own standard communication protocol just to try and impose some order internally.
Yeah, just to get their own systems talking consistently. And then if they had to integrate, say, a component from an outside supplier with its own way of talking,
They had to translate it again.
exactly, translate it into their internal standard. It just highlights these really deep architectural problems that legacy automakers face when they're relying on this patchwork of systems from different vendors.
That makes me think of Conway's Law. Someone mentioned that too, right? Data Drive Angel.
Yes, good point. Conway's Law basically says your system design will end up mirroring your organization's communication structure.
So big siloed companies.
End up producing big, siloed, fragmented systems.
Yep.
Exactly. And another user, Chi, pointed out that, look, each individual decision, like creating a custom communication link for this one part, might have made sense in isolation at the time.
Sure, solves an immediate problem.
Right. But fast forward years, layer dozens of those decisions on top of each other across different teams.
Yeah.
And you end up with this incredibly complex, unwieldy monster that's almost impossible to manage efficiently.
And the problems go beyond just communication, right? Daniel HB also mentioned procurement, how they buy the hardware.
Oh, absolutely. That was another critical point. The relentless push for cost reduction often means procurement chooses chips that are frankly underpowered, barely capable of running the software they're supposed to support.
So saving pennies on the chip.
Creates huge headaches down the line.
Hmm.
The software teams are then left trying to make magic happen on hardware that's just not up to the job.
And when the infotainment system is slow or the features are buggy,
It's the software team that often catches the flack, right? Not the procurement decision that prioritizes saving maybe $1 per car over having enough processing power.
it's that classic penny-wise, pound-foolish scenario. Daniel HB even shared a story from a previous job at a storage company, same issue. Cost-cutting on flash drives meant they wore out way too fast because of excessive logging, all to save a tiny amount up front.
You know, this whole situation brings up that concept discussed by Maria and Whistle on Hacker News,
Yeah.
the worse is better philosophy.
Right, the idea that you rush something out the door, even if it's not perfect, just to be first.
Exactly. Prioritize speed to market over maybe a more robust, well-thought-out design. Get it out now, fix it later.
But Nemaria argued pretty strongly that the fix-it-later part is often wishful thinking, especially with hardware limitations, right?
Yeah, you can't easily just patch a fundamentally flawed architecture once it's baked into millions of cars on the road. Those early rush decisions can become cemented, leading to long-term pain, constant bug fixing, just keeping the lights on, essentially.
Okay, so shifting gears slightly. The discussion also touched on Tesla. Obviously, they get praised for their vertical integration, doing hardware and software together.
Mm-hmm. Generally seen as an advantage.
But it wasn't all praise, was it? I think W443 book brought up some criticisms.
That's right. They pointed to things like the yoke steering wheel, the placement of the horn button, questioning some of those user interface choices.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that even if you control the whole stack, you can still make design decisions that users find awkward or just don't like.
Which kind of amusingly led to this whole side discussion about horn etiquette.
Yeah, people chiming in about how horns are used constantly in places like Vietnam or more, let's say, expressively in Italy or India.
It's a fun little tangent, shows how interaction with cars is about more than just software, even when we're talking about a software-controlled horn button.
Totally. But okay, back to the core challenges for the traditional guys. We had Gary Firestorm, someone working at a big three automaker, give some really valuable inside perspective.
What did they highlight?
They talked about this clash between the established kind of rigid waterfall development culture and the need for more agile software practices.
Waterfall versus agile, yeah, classic conflict.
And they really emphasized the heavy reliance on external suppliers, how the constant cost cutting affects component quality and also talent retention. It's hard to keep good engineers when they're frustrated.
And trying to adopt something like Tesla's zonal architecture, where you have fewer, more powerful computers controlling zones of the car.
Gary Firestorm said it's really difficult. High costs plus engineer turnover means you lose the expertise needed to implement such a big change. Even tiny savings, like cutting a few cents worth of memory, add up negatively when you make millions of cars.
And they mentioned engineers leaving and being replaced by more administrative roles, not the tech people needed.
Yeah, that was a concerning observation, losing that deep technical knowledge.
This seems to line up with what Whiteboard said, someone with experience at a major German automaker. They talked about a decline in actual in-house R&D.
Right. Whiteboard traced it back to cost-saving measures starting in the early 2000s, leading to this heavy reliance on outsourcing everything. Technology, in their view, often gets treated like, just some seasoning you sprinkle on top, not a core strategic ingredient.
Not fundamental to the car itself.
Exactly. And Vijay elaborated on that outsourcing model, describing these complex chains of subcontractors. Like, the software for a side mirror might be developed by a company, hired by another company, hired by the main supplier, who was hired by the car maker.
Wow, that's layers upon layers. Easy for things to get lost in translation, I imagine. Quality control must be tough.
You'd think so.
No.
And Whiteboard basically concludes that the customer is the one who ultimately suffers. They get poor usability, unreliable systems, interfaces that change constantly and make no sense. That frustration with touchscreens for everything came up again there, too.
Yeah, that's a big one. People seem to really miss physical buttons.
Absolutely. And then BJC50 added another layer, arguing that maybe the traditional companies are just fundamentally resistant to the whole EV shift.
How so?
Viewing software as mostly just for the radio and navigation, not as core to how the car operates, performs, preferring to just keep churning out variations of existing combustion engine models.
And the risk there is.
Getting left behind, basically. PGC50 suggested that unless they're protected by tariffs, they could easily be overtaken by Chinese companies who are all in on EVs and the software that drives them.
Okay, let's talk more about that penny pinching. We touched on it, but users like doodlebugging and T really hammered this point home, didn't they?
They did. That example of saving, say, 4 megabytes of memory per car sounds
Oh.
tiny, right? But multiply that by millions of cars, and it looks like a big saving on paper.
But the downstream consequences.
They're huge. It cripples performance, makes future software updates incredibly difficult or impossible. And ARC gave a worrying example, deliberately reducing the accuracy of traffic sign recognition just to save a bit on hardware costs.
Sacrificing a safety feature for cost savings? That's
Yeah.
not great.
Not ideal, no. And then you have John Rogers offering a kind of pessimistic view, saying that while car companies have tried to fix their software problems, buying tech companies and so on,
It often doesn't work.
yeah, because they don't address the root causes, the cultural issues, the established automotive way of doing things tends to just smother the innovation they acquire. Lots of money spent, but maybe not much fundamental change.
And that outsourcing strategy itself is maybe flawed for software. Whatever the platforms were designed for swapping suppliers easily, right? For cost reasons.
Exactly. Designed for flexibility in sourcing the cheapest parts, which worked okay for mechanical bits, maybe.
But software isn't just a bolt-on part.
That's what Lieb and Eggs pointed out. You can't just treat complex software like an interchangeable commodity.
Yeah.
It needs deep integration, though whatever one did acknowledge that strategy probably was profitable for a long time.
Which brings us to the whole debate about the infotainment system itself. Should they even be building these complex built-in systems?
Right. Imglor basically asked, why not just fully embrace CarPlay and Android Auto? Let the phones handle navigation and entertainment. Billions are being spent developing these native systems that are often, well, not as good.
Makes sense. But there's pushback. Gary Firestorm had a counterpoint.
Yeah, the automakers are wary of handing over that whole user experience and, crucially, the user data to Google, Apple, Amazon.
The data aspect, right.
So that explains why some companies, GM, Rivian, Tesla, included resist full integration. They want to own the dashboard, own the customer relationship.
And Imglorp also noted that EVs designed from scratch have an easier time integrating phone mirroring cleanly compared to older architectures.
True. And Eric Plus chimed in wanting that seamless experience,
Yeah.
where your accounts, your preferences just follow you into the car effortlessly. We're not quite there yet.
And the quality of the software that is in cars now seems all over the map.
Massively varied. Sazit shared a story about a recent non-Tesla car with just shockingly bad software, while Android Auto worked perfectly fine in their other car.
And Ploxelin made that critical point. You often don't realize how bad the software is until after you've bought the car.
Right. It's not something you can easily evaluate in a 15-minute test drive, which led PJC50 to suggest maybe software should be evaluated or even sold separately from the hardware to create a real market for quality.
Interesting idea. A bit radical, maybe.
Perhaps. Speaking of radical, Rust Cleaner floated the idea of a sales tax on products with closed, proprietary systems unless they met certain open standards.
Wow, really pushing for openness and repairability there, concerns about abandoned software, wanting more user control.
Exactly. Though, on a brighter note, Fopis did share a positive story. Their car's built-in navigation got significantly better after a software update.
So improvement is possible even on existing hardware.
Sometimes, yeah, shows optimization can happen, but the inconsistency is wild. Type with Rhythm pointed out how even within the VW group, an Audi and a VW can have vastly different, sometimes terrible, interfaces on basically the same platform.
And 71BW called modern Audi software a dumpster fire, while still giving Tesla props for their underlying tech ecosystem, despite other issues. And VW investing heavily in Rivian because of their software and electronics. That says a lot.
It really does. It signals that they recognize the problem internally.
There was also some debate about whether it's really the electronics' fault when infotainment is laggy.
Yeah, Gizmo argued that automakers have full control over the infotainment software, so just blaming the hardware is too simple. Vertical integration can help, sure, but if there's no consumer pressure or choice driving competition for better software, just controlling the hardware doesn't guarantee a good result.
And Haxer suggested that standard general-purpose hardware should be perfectly adequate for most infotainment tasks anyway.
Right. It shouldn't necessarily require bespoke cutting-edge chips just to run maps and music smoothly.
So if the legacy automakers do want to build their own electronics, why does it take so long? Omega 3 asked that.
Good question. Steve Adams 86 offered some reasons. Hardware development cycles are just inherently long and complex, much longer than software. Plus, there's that internal resistance to massive change in big, established companies.
Inertia.
Big time. And Rep Faria mentioned the super long lead times in the automotive supply chain. Everything just moves slower. Philip Allstar added that these companies are often structured more around managing suppliers and meeting regulations than actually building core tech themselves.
Which leads to ideas like, well, why not just stick an iPad on the dash? Tyler kind of provocatively suggested that.
Huh. Yeah, simpler interface. But that immediately ran into the strong counter-argument from VV3 and many others.
Hmm.
People want physical buttons, knobs.
The safety, right? Easier to use without looking away.
Exactly. Especially for crucial things like climate control, volume, wipers. Fumbling through menus on a touchscreen while driving is not ideal.
And that touches on deeper safety concerns, doesn't it? And David 626 seemed really worried about software-defined vehicles.
Very much so. They highlighted potential reliability issues with driver assist features and this feeling that maybe the focus isn't always on writing truly robust, fail-safe code. There isn't always a clear reward for it.
Which connects to that desire for simpler vehicles, like the slate truck concept that came up.
Yeah, back to basics. Though Zelos did offer a counterpoint, noting the safety benefits of things like automatic emergency braking, which is software-driven.
True, it's not all bad.
But Zelos also worried that easy over-the-air updates might reduce the pressure to get the software absolutely right the first time. And Graham28 voiced that underlying fear of having safety-critical systems constantly connected to the internet.
Speaking of connectivity, the EU's mandatory e-call system came up.
Yeah.
That requires LTE chips in all new cars, right?
Correct. Users like Basut and Schuster discussed that. And it immediately sparked privacy concerns from Rust Cleaner and others. Constant potential tracking, no obvious off switch.
Even though the intent is safety automatic emergency calls after a crash?
Right, Ponectar and Fire Beyond argued for the safety benefits. But the privacy trade-off is definitely a concern for many.
This all fuels that desire we keep hearing for simpler, more analog cars. SmartMic expressed that really clearly reliability and security concerns, driving a preference for less software dependency.
And Serial Dev praised the Dacia Duster specifically for its physical controls and use of proven older Renault tech. Reliable, if not cutting edge.
Though some pointed out safety drawbacks of truly old, simple cars, too.
Fair point. But HP Squared reminded everyone that there are strict safety standards, like ISO 26262, specifically for critical automotive software, separate from the less critical infotainment stuff.
Okay, good to know. But even current driver assistance systems seem to have issues. Row 1243 shared experiences with random emergency braking, glitchy lane assist.
Yeah, raising questions about whether these mandatory systems are always making things safer or sometimes introducing new, unpredictable risks.
And back to the interface, those touchscreens for essential functions. GigaChad had a bad experience in a BMW rental, Dragon Strength, with a Subaru. Just trying to adjust the AC becomes this distracting task.
Completely contrasts with the instant tactile feedback of a physical button or knob, as Plenz and Tharkun emphasized. Safer, faster, less frustrating.
Mullman summed up a core issue as this clash of cultures, right? The traditional auto industry's physical engineering focus versus the software world's faster, sometimes fix-it-later approach.
Yeah, that analogy of a Windows that can kill you really drives home the stakes involved when software controls critical vehicle functions.
And attracting the right people to bridge that gap is hard. We heard about the talent and compensation issues.
Big time. Lower pay compared to big tech, needing developers to move to traditional auto hubs. A lot of reading, GAF, Cosmic Gadget, all touched on this. It's tough to compete for top software talent.
Even though embedded engineering can pay well, as Jamie99 noted.
True. But the perception and perhaps reality for many roles is that it's less lucrative. Plus, Frank Wilhoit mentioned outsourcing development to firms that maybe lack deep expertise, leading to quality issues. The really good embedded engineers are in high demand and can command top dollar, often for cleaning up messes.
This whole situation fuels the debate. Are modern cars just too complex? Do they need constant updates?
That's a key tension. Joker and Cosmic Gadget argued, yeah, they're complex systems. Bugs are inevitable, updates are necessary.
But others, Jamie99 Nur, pushed back, saying cars from, say, the 90s or 2000s were reliable for driving functions without needing constant internet-delivered patches.
Right. There were recalls and service bulletins done at the dealer, sure. Yeah. Bronson, a lot of reading. But not this constant OTA update cycle for core functionality. Jamie99 felt maybe computerization has overshot the optimal point.
And Urolithatep 1 suggested OT updates are often driven by the manufacturer's desire to save money by fixing bugs after shipping rather than getting it right initially.
It's cheaper than a recall, definitely. And RGSISU reminded us, updates used to happen via the OBDII port at the dealership anyway.
Seems like a strong preference among some for code that simply doesn't exist and therefore can't have bugs for basic driving controls in there.
Keep it simple for the critical stuff.
We also briefly heard that UI UX designers and the software engineers implementing those designs are often different teams, which could add another layer of disconnect.
Potentially, yeah. Leads to calls like Windudes for less software overall, more separation between systems, more standardization, more open platforms.
But manufacturers have incentives to keep things closed, right? For service revenue, feature subscriptions.
Exactly. It pushes against openness and the right to repair movement. Jim 1234.
So, who's actually winning the software war, according to the article and discussion?
Well, Elijah Lin highlighted the article's conclusion. Companies like Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, many Chinese automakers seem to have an edge because they started fresh, without the baggage of legacy systems.
Built from the ground up for software integration.
Pretty much. But the real wild card, as Eric Mulcack pointed out, might just be consumer tolerance. How much buggy software are people willing to put up with?
That's a great question. And we saw a real world example of the volatility with GM's Cruise, didn't we? Topher Peterson noted how quickly they vanished from the streets, replaced by Waymo. Shows how tough this autonomous software space is.
Absolutely. Which might be why users like NotetoTorp are saying they actively want to avoid software-defined vehicles. Concerns about the infotainment, lack of physical backups for critical systems, potential for features being turned off remotely.
NotetoTorp also made a good point about how hard it is just to build a high-performing software team. It requires specific culture, leadership. Maybe automakers underestimated that challenge.
Very possible. Mostly Stable had this interesting thought. Maybe the answer to the problem is simple, but just really hard to implement organizationally. So companies chase complex solutions that ultimately fail.
And sometimes the quality is surprising in unexpected places. Catigula found Toyota's driver aids, ADS, to be much better than competitors, even fancy brands. Suggests maybe some companies are quietly competent, focusing on reliability over hype.
Could be. Focusing on minimum compliance versus genuine excellence.
Hmm.
Which brings us back to Cosmic Gadget's point. Poaching a few top executives won't fix things if you don't address developer compensation and culture lower down.
Because ultimately, as Peter Schurer put it, the new car is a computer on wheels. Software and batteries are the key differentiators now.
Right. And building the software organization needed is expensive, as Eggy0 noted. It's not just hiring a few star VPs.
We saw a concrete example of the pain with Wave 1016's experience in new Audi with a constantly rebooting infotainment system. Just highlights the frustration when legacy players get the software so wrong.
Leading to the fundamental question from GitRoom, is all this software actually making cars better? Or just adding complexity and problems?
A fair question, and Javier Cornejo put it bluntly. Automakers have no excuse for bad software in this day and age. It's not a new field.
True. And replacing bad factory systems isn't always easy either, as Vagabond P found out trying to swap out an inadequate unit.
So it circles back to that desire for simplicity. Just basic, reliable transportation like Nelblue and Xabriel wanted.
Maybe something like that slate truck concept, Nelbu, Molman, basic, customizable, less reliant on integrated tech.
Or maybe new architectures like Rivian's zonal ECU approach, API, offer a path forward, more manageable perhaps?
Potentially. It's definitely seen as a more modern approach. And Varda made the crucial final point. This software war isn't just about the screen you touch. It's about the firmware and dozens of controllers all over the car, stuff you never see.
Okay, wow. That's a lot to unpack. So, summarizing this deep dive, it feels like the core challenge for traditional automakers really is that deep integration of hardware and software.
Yeah, hampered by legacy systems, complex outsourcing, ingrained culture, and maybe not prioritizing software as truly strategic until recently.
And we see the newer players like Tesla, Rivian, and others in China having an advantage because they started clean, building the electronics and software together.
Right. But even they face challenges with design choices and meeting user expectations. And then there's this whole ongoing debate about how much software we even want in our cars versus reliability, safety, privacy, and usability concerns. Physical buttons aren't dead yet.
Absolutely. So what does all of this mean for you listening? As the cars we drive become, well, increasingly defined by the software running inside them, this exploration really highlights a critical moment for the whole industry.
That's a massive shift.
Yeah. So the big question remains, can the traditional automakers truly adapt, pivot, and compete effectively in this software-centric world? Or will the future of driving belong to the companies that are essentially building computers on wheels from the software up?
It's definitely something to think about as you consider your next car, what features matter most, and what kind of driving experience you really want.
A lot to mull over. Thank you for listening to Sting Tao's podcast.